With us today, we have Assistant Professor Brady Brewer, as well as Executive Director Emeritus and Professor Emeritus Dr. Dave Downey. They are going to be looking at trends in purchasing behavior, the importance of e-commerce, omni-channel marketing, and the changing nature of sales. Dr. Brewer.
I welcome everyone to this week's Tuesday Tailgate Talk. So as Taryn just said, today Dr. Dave Downey and I are focusing on the issues around e-commerce, and there's a lot going on in some respects in the entire ag value chain as we think about data and how it's affecting the ag value chain and transforming how we do business and communicate. So with that, I'm going to pause and let Dr. Dave Downey introduce himself and give his perspective on this e-commerce topic.
Well, let me begin by saying how excited I am to be working with you, Brady. I've been around for a year or two doing these kind of things. Always been very interested in farmer buying behavior and how we market to farmers. And I don't know that I've ever been more excited about agricultural marketing and selling to farmers than I am today, because things are changing so darn fast. And a lot of the research that you're currently doing and are planning to do over the next several months really add a lot of depth to that whole monitoring, putting metrics around some of these changes. There's so much going on with agribusiness. I mean, farmers are impacted with some of the greatest challenges I remember in my lifetime, and all kinds of things. The bad weather we had last year sure didn't help any. We have low commodity prices for a variety of reasons. We've got global marketing issues, challenges, and if that weren't enough, then we got the whole COVID-19 thing going on, and that's caused processors in some areas to shut down, and it's caused logistics disruptions, and it's caused labor shortages, especially for those people that are in areas where they have a lot of fresh products going to market. This has been really a trying time. But every time in my career, there's been a tough thing going on. We've learned a lot. We've changed how we do things. And I think that's about what's going on here. And all of that, of course, makes it much more difficult for our friends in the farm supply business who are selling to producers and growers across the country. Travel's been restricted by a lot of companies. That's put real pressures on how we normally do things. We got communications that's a lot more electronic, especially during the last several months as we've been restricted in travel. We've got farmers who are often somewhat less willing to do face-to-face as we normally have done. And then, of course, e-commerce, it's been hitting us for a few years now. As I understand it, some of the rumors I'm hearing, it's had a bit of an uptick this year as farmers are looking for ways to buy things, especially some of them. By the way, Brady, I know that you've been doing an awfully lot of research and recently on electronics and how data information is flowing in that marketplace. E-commerce, Brady, how do you define that? And what kind of things are going on from your perspective in e-commerce?
Yeah, Dave, that's a very important point because I think a lot of people have some different definitions of e-commerce. And I do want to take this point to pause real quick and just say, for those of you that are on this call, on this Zoom call, feel free, if you have a question, turn your mic on, turn your video on. If you so choose, interrupt Dave or I as we go through this conversation. And ask your question then. If you don't want to turn your mic on, then you can either message Dave or I during this conversation, or you can message Taryn and she will interject us and ask your question then, because we want to be very cognizant that this is a pretty hot topic and there's probably a lot of questions out there from the audience. So feel free to interrupt us as we go along. So
I'm glad you brought that up, Brady, because I think we want this to be a dialogue. I always enjoy talking to you because you got so much going on that intrigues me. You're the researcher guy, and I obviously am not. So I got a lot to learn from you, but we all do, and I've got questions for you for sure.
Well, that means a lot coming from you, Dave. And, for those of you that have been on some of these other Tuesday tailgate talks that we've had. And we try to keep this very informal. We try to say this is just like if two farmers met in a cornfield and got on their tailgate and just started talking about what's the current event. So that's how we want to keep it. We want to keep it fairly informal. I know a lot of extension presentations we do at the university are more formal, but we also, we want to bring in the information from those type of talks, but allow it to be a conversation.
So tell me what you mean by e-commerce.
Yeah. So, I think, Dave, e-commerce to me is a very broad term. When I think of all those issues that you just mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic, how sales is changing, how companies may be restricting travel. There's a lot that goes into that. And for me to think about e-commerce from a broad level, it's interacting with the customer through a digital mean. Now that can manifest in a lot of different ways. I think when a lot of people hear e-commerce, they think of the Amazon type of model, right? The getting the delivery, zero touch point with the customer logs onto a website, clicks, they'll purchase a product, and then it shows up at their house without a salesperson interacting with them. And that is by definition a form of e-commerce, but there's a whole lot more to e-commerce in my mind than just that type of business model. And we're seeing that type of business model appear in ag. We all know those major players that are providing competition in the ag space, where farmers can just log on and buy ag inputs and then it shows up at the farm. But there's so much more that e-commerce is providing. So the story I always like to tell that in my mind encompasses e-commerce is the story of Target. For those of you that went to our national conference in November, I think Jason Lusk commented on this story, and I have also told it before at another presentation, but I think it's too important not to tell again in case there are people on this call that haven't heard it. So we're all familiar with Target. It's a big box retail store, and it's a fairly in-person experience. So this is a pretty relatable story to agriculture. Agriculture has typically been a very face-to-face interaction environment. Same thing with Target and Walmart, right? I mean, yes, they both have websites that you can go purchase stuff online, but a lot of their marketing, a lot of their commerce is now being driven by this data and electronic collection of information about their customers. So for those unfamiliar with the story, Target got in trouble a couple years ago because what they were doing is, if you sign up for their rewards program, I think for them it's called like Cartwheel or something, they collect data on their customers. And what happened to them is they were piloting a program where they collected data on particular products that their customers were buying, and they used a algorithm to then predict what other products their customers may want to purchase. What happened was that a teenage girl in Minnesota, which is where Target is headquartered up in Minneapolis, where they were piloting this program, she bought a basket full of goods that Target then used to predict that she's probably pregnant. And they sent her an advertisement that was like, hey, you're expecting, here's some coupons for some products that expecting mothers typically buy. Well, she was still living at home at the time. Her dad got the advertisement and he was very mad. He went to Target, made a scene, said, why did you think that my girl, my daughter is pregnant, yada, yada, yada. It was not a good situation. Well, come to find out, he went home, confronted his daughter, and it turns out she was actually pregnant. So Target knew that his daughter was pregnant before he did. Funny story. Now we look at it.
Well, not so funny for them.
Not so funny for them, but to me, that's the essence of e-commerce. They were using their digital platforms to better understand their customer and predict what they wanted and to better serve their customer. I think maybe a more direct comparison to this, is something that a lot of us are now purchasing. So on the left of your screen, this is the Google Home. On the right is the Amazon Alexa. We all know that these companies collect information on us. This is a touch point. This is replacing a salesperson touch point with these companies so they can better predict what I, as a consumer, want. This is e-commerce in its essence. Yes, I know that these companies in some instances, I mentioned the Amazons of the world, and that's what a lot of people think of when they think of e-commerce. But it's more than just getting online and clicking purchase and it being shipped to your front door. Marketing, so if you remember, if you go to Marketing 101, marketing is more than just the advertisements being sent. It's understanding your customers and gathering that information. It's the continual feedback loop of using that information to better your product, then using that product to go better have a go-to-market strategy for your customers. So Dave, does that answer your question on what I view or what I think of the definition of e-commerce?
It does, and I think it makes some of the earlier information I've seen from you make a lot more sense. It isn't just about clicking a button, buying things. It's about how we understand our customer better, how we communicate with the customer more effectively on the kinds of things the customer is likely interested in. So that's really useful.
Yes, and this isn't unique outside of agriculture. Agriculture is going through this transformation as we speak. Again, this was a survey. You mentioned some of the research we've done here at the Center for Food and Agricultural Business, Dave. We did our data on data survey in 2019, and what we found is that 92% of agricultural companies collect some form of data.
So this information is all about ag companies.
Yes, this is all ag companies. So there's only 8%, a tiny fraction of companies out there are not collecting data. Now, this data is probably in some form, some of it's logistics, some of it's product data. Probably a lot of it is marketing data and being used in that e-commerce realm.
So this is more than just ag suppliers. This is throughout the ag system. Is that right?
Yes, throughout the entire ag value chain. So from ag input manufacturers to ag retailers, so that tells you how much data is out there in the system. But one thing we learned, Dave, when you look at the data and what's being collected, we then ask these same companies, okay, well, are you far ahead? Are you somewhat ahead? A lot of the companies, and the gist of this graph is that a lot of companies feel that they're behind the curve, right? They want to be the Amazons and the Targets that are using that customer data to better predict. And I think they're struggling with it a little bit. If you look here, look at the ag retailer and dealer category. Only 9% of the respondents say they're far ahead. Right? That's a pretty competitive landscape you're seeing out there. And in fact, 33% say they're at par, 11% say somewhat behind. You don't have too many saying far behind. And again, that's because all of them are doing it. 92% are collecting the data on their customers or on their competitors. But not a whole lot of them think that they're ahead of the competition. Same thing when we ask them to grade themselves. You look here at the ag input manufacturer, only 7% graded themselves as an A, right? So we have a lot of data, but we know that we're not necessarily doing a whole lot with it. And this, I really think comes, nothing says this better than there's a study by McKinsey that was done a couple years ago, McKinsey and Company, and they looked at 22 different industries, okay? They then had different factors that they ranked these different industries on, and agriculture cumulatively ranks 22 out of 22 in terms of the digitization of the value chain. That to me speaks volumes in terms of how far of a curve agriculture has left in terms of this e-commerce realm, right? We're last, 22 out of 22 categories in getting to the use of our data and using it to actually drive value in the value chain.
We got some catching up to do, Brady. I'm sure there's a lot of things when you think about e-commerce as being much broader than just transactional information, and we start thinking about all of the data that agriculture and farmers and growers are collecting and how they choose to use it inside their own business, how they choose to share that with other people. Frankly, we got a very traditional system yet. I realize it's under a lot of threat. We're working hard to kind of think about how how we can information transfer back and forth. Some of it's got to do with, do they trust people they're sharing it with? Do they want to share it or not? A lot of things going on. And yet the system is still pretty traditional. And as we begin to break out of that a little bit and think about using the data more effectively, what do we know about how farmers actually make the decision of who they want to do business with? Is there information on that?
So are you talking, Dave, in terms of information that they want to do business with, like the number? Or are you talking about the behavioral characteristics?
I'm talking about the kind of things they are interested in choosing which dealer, which supply source they're going to use.
Yeah, so at the center, Dave, we do every 4 years, we do the large commercial producer survey. So it's a national survey of farmers that looks at their buying characteristics and what preferences they use to make some of these buying decisions on. We look at salesperson call rates, so how often they want to be contacted by their salesperson. We look at their product attributes. Is value the number one attribute? Is price? Is product performance? We also look at their preferences for dealer retailer attributes. So how does service quality, how does relationship with salesperson play into that? There's about 8 or 10 different buying characteristics that we look at. And a lot of those play into this discussion here when we think about e-commerce. The touch points with the salesperson is a huge one. That, one of the things, and I'm going to do a little bit of an aside here, Dave. Thinking to the definition, why it's so important, the definition of e-commerce. A lot of people you talk with think that the e-commerce will replace sales. And I know you have a very strong opinion of this, and I definitely agree with you here. To me, e-commerce is not going to replace the sales function in a lot of businesses. To me, it enhances it, right? We've now just added this tool that can help the salesperson better understand their customer. So when they actually do make that sales call, it can be more impactful.
There's no question about it. Frankly, it will not replace, I believe, the salesperson. It does put the onus on a salesperson and the company they work for to do a couple of things. One of them is to build the trust with the customer, or make sure the trust is there, that we can adequately share information back and forth, both directions. And secondly, we may be able to, and I strongly believe this, we're able to enhance the relationship by the transfer of information and data. And it just isn't transactional information. Clearly, there's a lot of precision ag stuff, and there's a lot of information on each animal, each dairy cow. When that information is shared, that information provides real opportunities for both the buyer and the seller.
Yeah. So Dave, I mentioned the large commercial producer survey and the needing how frequently farmers want to meet. So here's some results of the 2017 survey, and we're getting ready to do the LCP here in 2021. And I'm very interested to see, all of these things that you mentioned at the beginning of this talk, Dave, that the COVID-19, has just forced people, I have friends, and this is outside of agriculture, but I know people now that pretty much consume all of the goods for their home online because they don't want to risk going to the supermarket or going to Walmart. And I think the same is going to be slightly, similar in agriculture. There's going to be a lot more farmers because we've been forced to decrease face-to-face meetings. So the graph up on the screen right now, what it shows is how often farmers want to meet with salespeople, or how often they're willing to meet, right? So you have a small percentage that say, yeah, most days if they drive onto my farm, I'm willing to meet with them. That goes up April through June when the crop is in the ground, especially here in the Midwest. And then you have your part of farmers, the 12% that say, no, I don't want to take time to meet with the salesperson because I'm too busy. I would rather do it in some other manner. 18% say, well, I want to meet with them once so I can, get the information I need. But other than that, I'm the one that'll initiate it, right? I don't want the salesperson coming to my farm because it's going to be too cumbersome for me to stop what I'm doing. In my mind, this is when we start talking about e-commerce, e-commerce is going to change how this graph looks, right? Because you're now, not only are you making, you are making the Amazon model of the world more accessible, but companies can now better understand their customers so that less face-to-face is needed because we have other touch points like the Amazon Alexa or the Google Home. And I know that, an agricultural company doesn't have maybe there is some agricultural company out there working on a Google Home or a Google Home for the shop, maybe, if you will, so they can learn what the farmer's talking about. But there are touch points that they can learn about the farmer that are digital, an e-commerce method that can reduce the frequency to which they need to actually go to the farm.
Brady, I would love to know what the conversations are about and who they're calling when they're on their tractor with a GPS system, who they're talking to and what they're talking about. And maybe that's not so far away. But when I look at this slide, this reinforces one of my major biases. It says, frankly, those numbers are probably off a lot, depending on whether you're a crop farmer or whether you're a livestock farmer, depending upon whether you're a large customer or a smaller customer, depending on whether you're a high-tech customer or you got most of it figured out yourself, depending on whether you have your own nutritionist or your own agronomist or you're dependent on somebody else, dependent upon the nature of your personality and how social you want to be, depending on what part of the country you're from. So those numbers simply, my takeaway on that is two things. One of them is there's a lot of different perspectives on that issue. Some people want a lot more contact with other people, and you darn well better understand your customer more than intuitive when you're thinking about your strategy for how you communicate with them. Maybe we'll talk about that more later. Second thing is, this was in 2017. I'm dying to find out what it's like in 2021, because you mentioned a moment ago, you're about to embark on your next of 7 in a row major studies of farmer buying behavior across the country. I'm dying to see what these same numbers look like in 2021.
Yeah, and well, my hypothesis is that it's going to be drastically different, right? Because our current environment is forcing rapid adoption of technology. I mean, my dad, who I never thought would have a smartphone, as a farmer, is now Googling part numbers on his smartphone, right? He doesn't have to call the dealership to say, hey, this belt, broke. Here's what I think it does. Here's where it's located. He can just do it right on his phone. That to me, I think is going to drastically change this. But I hope the takeaway isn't that it's going to result in less, and I've already said this a little bit, a less reduced role for a salesperson. I just think that the salesperson role is now going to be augmented to where they have a lot of information before they make that point of contact.
I like your word augmented, Brady. I think it is. Frankly, we have salespeople today who were born and raised on using digital information to both communicate with, to get information from, to use information from, and they don't even think twice about it. And then we got some older people like me who can do it, but it isn't natural and second nature. And so as we move to another generation of salespeople who utilize these things, by the way, calling on customers. One thing that really intrigues me is that, remember the good old days about 8 or 9 years ago when everybody's making so much money in agriculture, it was almost embarrassing? Let's get over the fact we thought that was what was going to be forever, and now we're back to some kind of reality. But at that time, there was a lot of money coming in agriculture, and there was an awful lot of next generation farmers who had the opportunity to come back into that farm operation. They were welcomed into it. And by the way, some of those operations are getting bigger and bigger and bigger to support more and more families. You've got that going on as well. But the issue is, I'm finding more and more as I work with particularly commercial farms, when we've got a next generation who is now entering the stage of their career where they're starting to make more and more of the decisions. using more and more tools that they were trained on in college or learned on their own. Spreadsheets are just nothing. That's just something they do every day, many of them. Not all, but many of them. And at the same time, Dad's saying, this isn't as much fun as it used to be back in this good old days, 10 years ago. Maybe I'd like to kind of find a way to make that succession plan actually start working a little bit more and backing away from it. So what I'm sensing is there's more and more pressure, even in 2-generation farms or sometimes 3-generation farms. I mean, currently 3 generations, where junior is now becoming senior. And that is rather, quite honestly, I think we're almost at a tipping point where this business to business marketing and sales is really becoming the way we do business with the majority of acres, the majority of pigs, the majority of poultry, the majority of dairy cattle. I mean, we've so much concentration is going on by another generation, and now the data thing is coming. And frankly, I shouldn't get on a soapbox here, but the reality is, how many people said 3 years ago they'd never order groceries on that darn thing, and now they're finding it's really convenient. And once you've done it 2 or 3 times, you say, oh. And we've got farmers that are using e-commerce in its more traditional definition, buying things online, that are finding, well, for some things I buy, maybe that's not so bad.
Yeah, and now everyone knows what if you mention Instacart, everyone has heard of it. I mean, but there's a lot. We could have a 3-hour conversation just over that topic.
We sure can.
So I do want to make one quick point, and this is related to that augmenting topic that we brought up just a few minutes ago, and it is very related to what you just said. So this is also from our large commercial producer survey. So we asked them to rank important attributes in selecting dealers and retailers. So they rank all 6 of these, 1 through 6. Notice what is ranked first 55% of the time. Service quality, right? That's what matters when people are choosing the dealer or retailer they choose to do business with. And this is why I use that term augmenting, right? Because, at the end of the day, it's not the relationship, the salesperson relationship. That's only ranked first 13% this time. It's still important, and it's ranked in the top 3 over half, right? So it's ranked first 13, second 17, and third 29% of the time is how you interpret this graph. So the salesperson relationship is important, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the quality and value proposition that the dealer retailer is offering their customers. And I think that's why this e-commerce topic, I like to broaden it up, and it's not just the Amazon model, right? It's what are you providing to help drive value to your farmer. Sometimes it's increased or saving them time, and that in that case it is that Amazon model. But a lot of times it's helping them be more profitable. And that's where I think that knowing your customer part of the e-commerce and how the data is driving that portion of the marketplace, that's 55% of the time they choose on service quality. So if you can help drive the service quality and the value proposition, that's the winning there.
Brady, you used that term Omni Marketing. It's kind of a popular term nowadays. I want to make sure we all understand what Omni Marketing means. Probably means different things to different ones of us. But to me, it is about offering more choices for how the customer does business with you. And today we see quite a few farm suppliers offering their product in the traditional way because it's effective, but also simultaneously offering a channel that is a bit more electronic in nature. I'm really anxious to see what this chart looks like next time around. I'm not so sure this one will change so much, but the definition of what service means is probably evolving, because service may have a lot to do with how easy it is to do business with you. Traditionally, we thought service means delivery, and it means on-farm help when you got a problem, and it means how you get taken care of. Well, sure, and that's going to continue to be there. But as farms get more consolidated and larger, some operations, I emphasize not all, will not want to do a lot of those things themselves. They want to outsource them, and service quality will mean much what it's always meant. But now it's taken on even more of a business perspective. It may be how easy it is to find what I really owe you. My invoice has always been so difficult to understand, and it takes me so long to get it. I really like to be able to access my invoice anytime I want to find out what I currently am doing. I like that. That's service. The ability to get access to a service person immediately when I've got an issue is increasingly important in this everything right now world that we're living in. I'm thinking that the word service, quality, and availability, and even relationship with the salesperson. I need a salesperson on my operation that understands intuitively when I need to be called and when I don't. I don't mean how much I like it or not. I mean, anticipate the issues I may be having. And if I can anticipate those, I can be more proactive in communicating not only with the frequency, but armed with the information the customer may more likely be interested in or need at this particular time in the production cycle. I just think that this whole way we do business with B2B type selling environment. Oh, by the way, I got to come back and say though, Brady, it's a long time before the traditional customer is not going to be there. I mean, the traditional customer who buys things just about the way they did 5 years ago is still there. Many of them are still able to pay their bills because their own land is paid for, or their animals are they're financed reasonably well, and they like what they're doing. It works for them. But that part of the marketplace that is depending upon other resources to complement what they can do, that's what's changing so rapidly.
Yeah, and so I'm going to share my screen again here. And again, I do want to reiterate, if anyone has any questions, feel free to interject or text them to us. So you talked, Dave, about farmers that want to do some stuff themselves. So we also asked the farmers in our large commercial producer survey the number of suppliers they compare when buying expendable products. So only 15% rely on only look at one dealer or retailer. 15%. In my mind, that's a pretty small number, right? 85% look at two or more. Around half do look at only two, which I think, so they're comparing between two different dealers or retailers. But then you have 38% that look at three or four or more, right? With 10% looking at four, 5, 6, or 7. To me, this represents this is another graph that I'm going to be interested to look at in our next iteration of this survey, because I do think that the e-commerce realm is going to shift this to the right. We're going to see more farmers, even some of those traditional farmers that you mentioned, Dave, will be more likely, because the information is going to be more readily available, going to be more likely to look at 2, 3, 4, 5 different options before they buy product.
That's a good point. How people get competitive information is much easier now than it was even 3 years ago. And so that becoming part of the decision process will force all of us to be a little more aware of the value that we're creating and the importance of communicating that value to that marketplace. Frankly, those last 2 columns on that list are what I call shoppers. Frankly, I know probably who a lot of those people are. I'm not sure I approach them at all the same way. The first 2 columns on that, yep, we have some farmers that are pretty loyal, like to do most of their business for good reason. It's simpler to do business with one person as long as you trust them, as long as you think they're good, as long as you work with them. But because they may have two suppliers. The second supplier may often be not the preferred supplier, but an important supplier for some products. Also, it's a way of kind of keeping people honest. You make sure the guy that's doing most of your business doesn't get too full of themselves and take you for granted. Hear that a lot of times. I get better service if you know that I've got somebody else. Oh, by the way, turn that around the other way. If I know that my customer is looking at, if I'm the second in line, it gives me the opportunity, if I know that customer well enough, to create unique value for that customer. Then I have a strategy for perhaps getting my foot in a wider crack in the door and demonstrate that I can do some things that the preferred supplier can't. By the way, I don't.
No, so Dave, you're touching on, I think, a really important point here. There is a huge correlation and this graph relative to the graph that we showed earlier, where we were looking at what farmers, how often a farmer prefers a salesperson to contact them. I think these two concepts are extremely related in this whole e-commerce realm, right? If we know that farmers, or I say no, if we think that farmers are going to be comparing more businesses or options of where to purchase, and they're going to be collecting more data, but we also know that, you know, businesses will be collecting more data on the farmers as they shop around. So Dave, I'm going to flip this question back to you. How does this impact the salesperson's role in this? If we know that the farmer is going to be shopping around more, how do salespeople respond?
Well, first of all, they decide they got to understand what their own cost structure is in their business, so that they're not forced in or tricked into giving away things that they shouldn't be giving away. It costs money to provide a lot of services, and to provide services, you got to get paid for them. Often they're going to be competing with e-shoppers, if you will, where the offer is not very clear. It is we get tricked by that, and consumers of all kinds of looking, a price really looks good, and so I'm all excited about it, and then later on find out that, well, it didn't have this, and I thought everybody did that, but it didn't deliver the right way, or it wasn't the same quality quite, got all that kind of stuff going on. So subtly, a salesperson, if they want to do part of that business at a little higher margin than the competitor is offering it, need to be really skilled in creating the understanding of what the customer is not going to get from someone else. So understanding your own cost structure, understanding your ability and need to be able to communicate the value that you're creating. And by the way, sometimes that means let them go ahead and buy from some cheap source until they find out that it wasn't all it's cracked up to be, and then they come kind of sheepishly back to you. And of course, you got to make them feel that that was a smart decision and that you don't think they're stupid or anything. And you gain depth with the customer through some of those situations. So there's a lot of elements of, one of the elements I think of is understanding that customer, is understanding what the customer's business model is, Brady. By business model, I mean, I love spending time with commercial growers, commercial producers, larger operations, because it's really fun to kind of try to uncover how it is they think about their business. And one of the things that I feel in my mind is that the larger the account is, probably the more unique they are in how they make decisions and what's important to them. The business model, I call that the factors, the variables that are especially important to how an individual customer prioritizes the activities in their business in order to maximize their profits or obtain the goals they're working for, which is not all financial. Sometimes it's succession plans. Sometimes it's reputation. Sometimes, it's a lot of different things. But until I know enough about the customer to understand how they think, then all I'm probably going to be doing is offering them a product, which, by the way, the customer may not fully understand the value of, at a price that makes me a commodity seller. And I have to be competitive on price if that's all there is. If I'm going to create value for that customer, I have to know what it is they value. I have to understand their business model. Some farmers believe they're going to make more money by focusing on some part of the operations, such as yield or efficiency of gain, or nutrition or herd health, or well, it could be a number of things. It is a number of things, but some things are more important than others. Only by understanding how they're thinking about those things, only understanding why they're making those decisions, do I have the opportunity to bring them product and service combination, as you called it, value, very astutely, that I can match what it is their value proposition needs to be. So this business is very important.
Yeah, and I to me, that's where if a salesperson can be armed with the knowledge of that before they even step foot, even if it's a cold call, if you have data on a farmer and you know their business model before you even step on their property, that's to me where you can really improve this entire the sales process, right? Because you know which products are going to be interested in. It allows you to target market. That concept, the targeting marketing approach, where you already know, hey, they're not interested in these products we have because it doesn't align with their management style and what they want for their farm.
Oh, absolutely. Before I step onto the property, might suggest something a little different than I'm thinking. You about got to step on the property to find out these things. And you have to be there in order to have a relationship that has enough trust in it, because you've been delivering what you said you were going to deliver, so that you develop some kind of a relationship with, so that you can get them to open up a little more and share with you what their business model is, what's important to them. And that brings up this whole idea of trust. How do you build, as a company, as a salesperson, the level or depth of trust so that the customer is willing to share with you information that's coming right off of their pigs, right off their herd, right out of their fields, into your operation, that you can turn around and help them discover ways of improving their operation they had not yet thought of. But if they haven't trusted you at that level, they're going to be reluctant to share with you at that level. And this takes time. What we've come to call it, what my son Scott talks about a lot in our programs is the discovery process. It's a way of getting closer and closer to the customer so that we have those meaningful conversations, not just about price. By the way, the column 3 and 4 on that list always want to open, talk about, and close with what's the deal. The people in the first 2 columns, once the trust level is at least moderately there, will gradually open up. Now, they'll almost always open up quicker on technical issues, because those are not so private. Those are not so personal. Talking about my fertility program, or talking about my feed ration, or talking about herd health, or ventilation in my barns, those are a little easier to talk about. But when we get into some of the business issues, like capitalization, and we get into the ideas that have to do with relationship with landlords, or when we get into personnel issues with my staff, those things are a little bit more personal. And what we're increasingly finding is that the salesperson has the relationship so that the farmer is opening up a little more about sharing technical information as well as business information, puts the salesperson in a much better position to bring to them ideas that will fit, not just generic ideas, information that will fit. To bring me something I don't know, not a product. I can find that information out online. I want information I haven't thought about before. I want you to help me be a better producer, a better grower. And to me, this whole data thing creates opportunities that are unparalleled.
So Dave, you mentioned the providing support, and I think it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? You got to have the farmer's data to provide the support, but you got to be able to have that relationship with them to have the trust before you can garner some of acquire some of that information. In our data on data survey that we did last year, we asked ag input manufacturers and ag retailers, do you use the farmer data? So actual, their information on their acres or whatever information it may be. And this can vary depending on, what part of the value chain we're talking about, if you're a, John Deere case or if you're a retailer. But 10% said they're always, whenever they can, they're using data to provide support back to the farmer. About 30% of the ag input manufacturers say most of the time, and 40% of the retailers. But this is where, when you think about that McKinsey study and ag ranks 22 out of 22, it's this 44 and 49%. So pretty much half of ag retailers and ag input manufacturers say, well, we're trying to, but we want to do more, right? I think that's where, when you think about the curve, the technology curve that ag is getting ready to go through, this is where a lot of the improvement's going to be, in that 44.5% and the 49%, right? Almost half of the agribusiness out there saying, we're trying to, but we're not really realizing the value to providing the support back to the farmers, right? That's I think where a lot of the improvement's going to come from.
Fascinating. Brady, I happen to know that you're better at sitting on top of data, remembering what's there to pull it out when you need it than anybody I know. I know you're sitting there on top of 500 different PowerPoint slides, and I know that you just reached into your bag and pulled out one we were talking about that's highly relevant. You always impress me. But I think you're exactly right. We're learning how to get there. We're moving that direction fairly quickly. We don't get it without the trust factor, and that trust factor doesn't build overnight, which is why the old relationships are still pretty important. You build that trust over time. You build that through doing what you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it.
I would probably argue that's why you still have the 44.5 and 49%, right? It's because those the people that answered somewhat haven't built that trust. They want to be in the always category.
Yeah.
But I think that trust factor is probably a major factor in why they're still in that somewhat category there. Is that trust. I mean, there's, every agribusiness is building platforms to try to provide support back to the farmers. And I think, when I look at the platforms, they do that, right? They allow the farmer to make better decisions. But for some reason, there hasn't been the uptake on the farmer side. Now, some farmers, our colleague Nathan DeLay and Jim Mintert over at the Center for Commercial Agriculture, they did the partner survey to this data on data survey, where they asked farmers how many companies they partner with to analyze their data. And, there were some farmers that said 7, 8, 9 different partners to provide support back to them. They're like, if you want to try to give me quality information to drive my business, they'll trust anyone and everyone. But there was also a fairly large percentage of those farmers that said, well, I don't really want, I don't trust you just yet. That's a pretty big concern for me.
And a legitimate concern. I know my data is valuable, but I don't always use it as effectively. Once the trust factor is there, some farmers believe that, and rightfully so, that if there is a good reason to trust, I will share that information to see what it brings back, what return it brings to me.
Yep.
Others say, not so much. I'm a little concerned about these things. And so we have different challenges in terms of working with different kinds of customers. I think that data is going to be changing over time, Brady, and your upcoming surveys are the kind of things that's going to tell us a great deal about where we are and what progress we're making. How we build trust. There are several issues in that. Our friends at KSU, Kansas State University, have done a lot of research on how that trust factor builds. It's very interesting stuff. It's a determination of 4 different things: the credibility you bring, the reliability you bring, the intimacy that the customer feels, and the amount of self-orientation they believe the salesperson or company brings. Credibility means you're not trying to convince them of things that are preposterous and they're out of sight. They're things that they can believe, they can understand, that make sense to them. Reliability means doing what you said you're going to do when you're going to said you're going to do it, because as soon as you don't deliver what you promised, they're saying, well, I'm not sure they're very dependable, and therefore that trust factor goes down. The intimacy is how familiar you are with their business. And then we talked about the discovery process. The last one's very important because it's got to do with self-orientation. Self-orientation is about how they perceive what you as a salesperson or a company are really interested in. Do I think your primary concern is how you can sell me more stuff? Or maybe how you can win a trip someplace? Or how you get a bonus? Or is your primary concern about how I can do better on my own farm? All of those play together. And I just think that trust issue is so important.
So Dave, you pretty much took the words right out of one of the farmers' mouths that I spoke to this spring, right? When we were talking about some of these issues around trust, they're like, well, I don't want my supplier to get the data because they're going to use it to turn around and sell me my same product at a higher price. And they were 100% convinced that is what would happen. And that's a huge topic that I don't have an answer to, because, to convince a farmer like that, you're going to use the data and actually turn around to try to provide them value and not, increase the price on them. I don't think there's anything I could have said in that situation that would have convinced them. I tried to explain to them, I was like, look, that company has every incentive to provide the value back to you, because if they do that, if they actually do increase the price, you have other options to go to, right? You can go to another retailer, you can go to another manufacturer and switch brands. They have every incentive to provide value back to them, but that argument was not ringing with them because they were convinced that there were some trust issues. That's what it boils down to.
Brady, one thing that really strikes me through all this is how fast things are changing and how this new COVID-19 environment we're in is forcing a lot of people to think a bit differently about their relationships. And as they're forcing to try some different ways of communicating, as they're experiencing people who are communicating them perhaps very effectively in some ways, not so effective in other ways, they're going to be adopting perhaps a little different approach to how they buy things. And so I am really fascinated by the opportunities that exist in this marketplace today. It is not going to be easy because we got some customers that are struggling big time right now. We've got some competitors that are struggling really big. Many of us are struggling big time, trying to figure out how we can keep all these balls in the air and make good decisions with it. But I am so excited to have you on our Center for Ag Business, Center for Food and Agribusiness staff to begin digging much more deeply than we ever have before into some of these critically important issues.
Yeah, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think we're on a path to go and try to answer some of these through some future research initiatives that we're going to be launching here over the next year. And that's exciting. And to be fair, Dave, I think the industry is evolving so fast that by the time we answer some of these, there's going to be a whole new set of questions that we need to go answer.
That's what keeps us in business, Brady. Don't forget that.
So one point that and we're running out of time here, we want to be cognizant that, keep this to an hour. But one point that we haven't really touched on, Dave, so we've talked a lot about the trust with the farmer and the salesperson's role with the farmer. But I do think that there's a little bit of room here when we think about the e-commerce. We broadly defined it as, knowing more about your customer and be able to inform your product. It's the entire marketing process, not just the farmer clicking buy and shipping it to their farm. There's a little bit of space. We need to spend a few minutes here at the very end talking about what about interactions B2B. there's going to be some partnerships and some platforms that are going to have to be developed. It's not just sharing the farmer's data, but it's sharing data amongst the ag value chain, right? I mean, if you're an ag input manufacturer and you want, the complete marketing process, your product doesn't get sold until it reaches the consumer at the grocery store. There's going to be some data sharing that has to happen between different businesses within the value chain. I think that's a pretty critical component as well.
Wouldn't disagree with that at all. Food processors and food manufacturers and food distribution tends to read the marketplace. They read consumers. And they think they know at least, and probably do know a lot about what's going on in the minds of the ultimate consumer. They will reflect that back through the system and gradually will build favored relationships with growers and producers of food products at the farm level for people who are willing to do the things that the processors, the manufacturers, and the food distributors think are important. And I think that's how we're going to feel those things more and more.
Yeah, but I think that's a pretty daunting task. And that's not saying for any one particular business, for the entire value chain. I mean, when you look at ag, vertical coordination, we're a pretty disaggregated value chain. We're not the Amazon that, Amazon typically acts as a retailer. But that's going to require a lot of coordination. And I am super fascinated, Dave, to see how that all plays out over the next 5 to 10 years as some of these processes we've been talking about happens, because it's a feedback loop, right? The feedback, consumers give the feedback, it works its way down the supply chain to the farmers and to the ag input manufacturers. And then the information about the product of what's happening down at the beginning of the value chain has to get transmitted all the way back to the consumer to maximize value. And that is something that I'm glad I'm not the one figuring all that out, because it's going to take time. There's going to be a lot of bumps along the way. And there's going to be different channels. I don't want to compare it to the omni-channel approach for how products, to the farmer, but there's going to be a lot of different methodologies tried. And I think that's the umbrella that all of this fits under.
Well said, Brady. If there's any questions hanging, we're happy to take them. But frankly, my concluding comment is simply that I've always defined marketing as the process by which a firm adapts to change. It's the things we're talking about right here is what the essence of marketing is about. And I think that you are going to be around to see much of this, Brady, because that's the kind of thing that you do professionally. And I've done through most of my career, and I'm going to enjoy every last minute of it.
Well, with that, we have about 2 minutes left. So I want to turn the floor back over to Taryn so she can introduce some of the upcoming programs that we have here in the Center for Food and Agricultural Business.
Yes, thanks, Brady. And I guess I am going to take it upon myself. If anyone has questions later as they reflect on the discussion between Drs. Downey and Brewer, please feel free to reach out to them or myself. We'll get you in contact, get questions answered. Our next Tuesday Tailgate Talk will be July 14th. Dr. Gray will lead a conversation with Dr. Castro and Orval Neto, 2 Brazilian professors on ag and ag business in Brazil. And then 2 weeks from that date, Dr. Scott Downey and Dr. Nicole Woodmar will be talking about Dr. Woodmar's piece, Consumer Corner, insights around ag based on industries outside of ag. We also in the center have a new program that we've launched, a series of micro courses. The first one was today with Dr. Gray. I'm not sure if anybody took part in that, but the next one will be July 15th with Dr. Pete Hammett, Organizational and Personal Resilience. And then Dr. Brewer will lead one on August 5th, Financial Implications for Your Business. So hopefully some of these things we have coming up are of interest to you, and or you can pass the information on to a friend or a colleague and get some more people involved in the center. But other than that, have a happy and safe 4th, and take care and stay safe in this world in general these days. Thanks again for tuning in.